This is the DLR Cast, the essential podcast for fans of Diamond David Lee Roth. All right, folks, welcome once again to the DLR Cast, the only podcast by and for fans of Diamond David Lee Roth. As always, I'm Steve, along with my good friend, Darren Paltrowitz. Darren, what's happening?
Steve, I can't believe we're on to episode 101. Wow. Nothing but yeah. Zows. What was that? I'm trying to think of other Dave trademark phrases.
What was that? There you go.
That? Yeah.
Well,
last time I checked, what was that was still abandoned. So meaning we could re-trademark what was that if you want it.
There's an idea there. We're going to have to noodle on that a little bit.
Crowdfunding, our listeners crowdfunding to own all of Dave's expired trademarks one by one.
Listen, if he's not going to go get $200,000 worth of missing money out there that you have tried diligently to let him know about, we can he doesn't care about the trademarks.
Well, fun fact, I'm not going to name names, but one of our listeners did have me find unclaimed funds for them, and I was happy to do that. And another listener of ours said, "Hey, I got a +1 to go see the Afghan Wigs and the Church in Brooklyn. Do you want to go?" And I went with him, and that was Og Stone, who has been very supportive of our show. So I think we kind of have the best fans because they pay attention to us. But I'm still waiting for Dave to say crayfish. He still hasn't said crayfish. Codfish?
Codfish, not crayfish.
Okay, the reason I said crayfish is the guy whose email code thing is crayfish. I'm actually interviewing him next week. And the whole reason I got that interview was I said to his handler, I said, "By the way, I know about crayfish." And they went, "Oh, you do?" So codfish.
Folks, we should make note of the fact that this is the only podcast on David Lee Roth co-hosted by a music journal, entertainment journalist, and private investigator.
I don't know about that. Are Dave and Dave Unchained? One of them is a music journalist. Do we know if the other Dave is a PI? He could be.
That I do not know.
He's got a PI-esque personality. Could Eric Senich be a PI? I know he works for the court system, or allegedly.
He does get a lot of great information.
We do have one listener who tried to get me set up with a PI job a while back. So there's always a chance we have one other evil spawn of this profession.
All right. Well, speaking of professions, the other co-host of this podcast is a publicist for a book publisher, and which is how I am thrilled to set up our guest here, the interview for this episode, Martin Popoff, one of the most prolific and most knowledgeable and informative rock journalists out there. He's written dozens and dozens and dozens of books, and he comes on the show to talk to Van Halen at 50, a encyclopedic biography of our favorite band, and we really get deep into it. We've got notes, we've got links to the books in the show notes. Full disclosure, like I mentioned, I work for the publishing company, but even if I didn't, I would be buying this book because it is filled with tons of photos and a lot of cool information. And Martin it's not just a suck up sort of, shine it as much as possible, beautiful portrait of the band. He covers it all, and it was a lot of fun talking to him.
Yeah, and to speak to Martin's reach and importance and all that, a month and a half ago when I was in Chile, I just said, okay, I got to go to a bookstore. I want to see what music books are for sale. And in this one store, I'm going to say of the 20 rock-related books they had, 5 of them were written by Martin and in Spanish. So for all we know, he's the preeminent rock journalist of South America, for all we know.
He certainly is in Canada, I think. So
yeah,
most prominent, prolific rock author, to say the least.
Yeah, and the books over the years on AC/DC, that was his
AC/DC album by album. Yeah, he's self-published. You can just find his website. The web address is I've got in the show notes there, and he's publishes a lot of stuff on his own for other publishers. He's done, at least 10 books for us. He's just a pleasure to talk to, pleasure to listen to. He does a couple podcasts, and he was gracious enough to spend some time with us.
And as we talk about within the interview, without giving much away, he has ideas on how Van Halen can monetize and keep the legacy going. So, Van Halen, I think, should buy this book. Think about that. A 30 is it 34.95 retail, something like that?
I think it's $40.
Okay,
Retail.
$40. And if they did that, Van Halen would have 3 more catalog titles of each where they'd get a minimum of $250,000 advance. So Van Halen's best investment would be in buying this Martin Popoff book. That's fair to say, right? And then they could write off the expense of that $40 book against the advance. So, well, bottom line is, I believe this book is sold through VanHalenStore.com.
Yes. Van Halen News Desk. Yep. They sell it through their store. And of course, it's available at bookstores and your usual digital places. And you can buy it direct through Martin as well, get an autographed copy. So, like I said, links are all in the show notes there. A lot of different places you can pick it up. And I love talking to the guy.
Yeah. And he, like us, he can be critical, but at the end of the day, he's a big fan who knows his stuff. So rather than being a Van Halen book, not naming names, it's some of the Van Halen books in the past few years, we're just basically rewrites of press releases and other people's books. No, this actually has original thoughts to it. Beautiful imagery, like a lot of these at 50 and at 75 books. So it's on brand there. And again, looks to the future about what Van Halen could do. And I think a lot of bands and a lot of journalists and managers can learn from what he writes in there. So on all ends, a great job done by Martin per usual.
Yes, indeed. Well, enjoy it, folks. As always, thank you for downloading and listening and sticking with us all this whole time. Episode 101 here, and we're still rolling along, and
nothing but
we're here.
And what was that? And Ink the Original, and all the other great trademarks that we will all be buying in the near future. But thanks everyone who's still listening.
Take care. Martin, how are you? Good to see you.
Doing fine, guys. Thanks for having me. Very cool.
Yeah. Thank you for making the time. Say right up front, as I did at the intro, in full disclosure, as I work for the publisher of many of your books, including this one we're talking about today, Van Halen at 50. I think a lot of people might know this format, but it's essentially the biography in 50 key highlights and even lowlights, and I'll get into that in a second too. Van Halen's career, celebrating 50 years as they formed back in 1974.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't come up with this idea. This is you geniuses at the publisher. So this is not an idea of mine, nor was the album by album thing, I don't think. But yet we've done a lot of books in both areas. So I've done personally the Bowie at 75. The AC/DC at 50, the Kiss at 50, and this one, and an undisclosed one with a different number from 40 or I might have let her out of the bag there. Different number from 50 or 75. But yes, I've got another one that I've just turned in the files to our intrepid leader Dennis over there.
All good. And just a reminder too, we'll have numerous links in the show notes. So it's a biography, but especially in particular, Van Halen, I look at Van Halen at 50. I look at this book really as it's an encyclopedia because you've got a discography in there. There's a great timeline. When I say an encyclopedia, I mean, it covers it all from the very rise to, well, the end of Van Halen, as we know it upon publication date. And of course, Eddie's passing, as tragic as it was. But I mean, I guess first off, we should probably ask, because we are the DLR cast, and we'll ask it up front. Are you a Dave guy or a Sammy guy? And we we don't hold back any punches. We're fans, but not fanboys for Dave.
Yeah, I would say I'm definitely a Dave guy. I mean, I would lean towards those albums more. So it's funny with Sammy. I always had and knew the history of Sammy, and obviously I think the first Montrose album is genius, and I'm even quite a fan of Paper Money. But you go along through that catalog, and us as kids, we were always basically the angry young metalheads, where we based every the merit of every album around how mathematically heavy it was, right? So Sammy was always this guy who never he wasn't wired like a heavy metal guy, yet he was making these fairly heavy albums all through that solo career. So On Board was never the hugest Sammy Hagar fan. I love his singing, and I think he's done some brilliant stuff later. I think maybe the best album he ever did was 1013. But I do love the Van Halen albums with him as well. But no, to me, when you actually encapsulate it with just this band, I'm definitely more on board with the David Lee Roth albums.
Now, if I could rudely hijack this conversation for a second. Martin, not only a big fan of your books, also the work that you did for Brave Words, so many interviews that you've done that I've read. And a mutual friend of ours, David Krebs, told me that he may or may not have 70 or so pages that you've written of an autobiography that's never come out, that will hopefully come out. But the bottom line...
It's a lot more than 70 pages. He's underselling it. We did a lot of interviews. And basically the idea was I interview him. He tells me all his stories. I get it all laid out and consistent and all that, and sort it into, a narrative and give it back to him. But he calls it 70 pages, but the way to measure books is how many words. And he's got enough there to basically do a short book at this point. One or two more interviews and he's got more than enough. So
I agree. My follow-up question before I go back into how great you are is how many times David tells you that you're wrong? Is that numerous, or
that's pretty interesting. We've had a lot of just straight conversations where we were talking about other stuff, and he's such a polyglot or a Renaissance man. Like, he knows a lot about a lot of things, right? He's a super interesting guy. He's very smart. Obviously, he's got a lot of schooling even. Yeah, that's funny. He would tell me I'm wrong a lot, for sure.
So tying that in with this book, now David, in our conversations, for those who don't know, David was one half of Lieber Krebs, which was original management of AC/DC, Aerosmith, Ted Nugent, Scorpions, the list goes on and on and on. And when David and I talk about music industry history, he talks about how management until maybe the 90s was not meant to be seen. It was kind of the people behind the curtains. Management did not do interviews. Now, in the case of Van Halen, I think that was pretty much the case until we heard about Sammy's departure from the band and Noel Monk did his stuff. We didn't really know who managed Van Halen for the most part. In your case with writing this book, was there anybody related to the band or management who is the least bit helpful?
No, I mean, I didn't basically go out and try to get any of that stuff. But yeah, we know there's Noel and there's Ed Leffler, and then there's, Ray Daniels is a bit of a buddy of mine. He's an acquaintance because I'm here in Toronto. He's here in Toronto, right, as well. And he's a funny guy, man. You could just be hanging out at a cocktail party with him or something, and he will just come out and tell you the most. He is so honest, right? And I wonder if a book from him, I don't think will ever be forthcoming, but a book from him would be amazing, right? But yeah, I mean, when you think of management in Van Halen, I think one of the main narratives, or one of the only ones that rises above the radar, because like you say, Darren, it's true. I mean, Van Halen, I guess, fits that whole model where management is not a huge part of the story, but it does come into play with Ray and the family relations and the sister-in-law stuff. And then of course, Gary Cherone and Extreme, they're managed by Ray Daniels at the same time that Van Halen's managed by Ray Daniels, oddly out of Toronto. And then that causes some very real Van Halen history when Gary joins the band for the 3 album, right?
Yes. No, Steve, I took this way off course.
No, you're way on. You're straight on course, and everybody knows the flow of our conversation here. We should have called this podcast. Yeah, we should have called this podcast the sidebar. But so, Martin, getting back to Dave here, one of the things, there's a lot that stood out to me here, but one of the things when you, in the chapter about the first album, that not a single eyebrow was raised about Dave's album. People love what Dave does nearly as much as what Eddie does. And that always led to a theory that I've kind of had, a two-part theory, that one, Dave brought the swing, the soul, so many covers that Van Halen would never have touched, and I think brought Van Halen out of what could have been a semi-decent Southern California prog rock career to a degree, and that he always has gotten, and much to his own fault, too much heat for his vocals. But even back then, there was all sorts of odd adjectives like caterwauling and wolf howling and stuff from Dave, and it doesn't seem like you shared that opinion back then, and I know I certainly never have.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, like, growing up as a kid, so I would have been 15, and I remember hearing that album like it was yesterday for the first time. Me and my buddy Forrest Toop on his parents' Yamaha 3020, 120 watts per channel, 160 watts per channel, Bose 901s in a beautiful carpeted, their living room. I remember hearing that album and the other one. So I'm growing up in a small town, Trail, BC. So there's no live thing or anything. There's obviously no YouTube. So I'm hearing the records, right? And we came up, it never crossed our mind that Dave couldn't sing. He sounded like the most authoritative, talking the other day with somebody, he almost reminded me as the leader of the band, the adult in the band, the Bon Scott figure in the band, the guy who's taller than everybody else, the guy who's more athletic than everybody else. He reminded us of that with that voice he had, because it was a very sort of a manly, take command kind of voice. He totally could sing. Now, as we learn later, it was, a laborious process getting vocals out of him. And then live, he couldn't sing, and he was always on the edge of getting fired, kind of thing. But, credit to Ted Templeman and Dave and the whole idea of just working super hard on his vocals. It never crossed our mind, 2, 3, 4 records in, right up to the day Dave was gone. It never crossed our mind that he wasn't an absolutely great singer, because it seemed like he could sing, but he also had this really kind of fluid, seamless way of lapsing into the joking around, the conversational, the shouting, the yelps, the from the low croon to the vocal fry stuff. There never seemed to be any problem with all of these tools in his toolbox. And I almost even feel that even later in life, when he really got a lot of heck for the voice is degrading, but you're also just like being too much of a firecracker and a loose cannon and not singing the lyrics and cracking jokes and all that sort of stuff. Even then, even in late, like the Las Vegas residency or whatever, the 2010s, it seemed like he was a little bit of a guy where you could imagine having a manager tap him on the shoulder and say, Dave, if you want to save your reputation, it's obvious you can sing more, just literally play by the rules a little more, because you could get glimpses all throughout that whole thing that he actually is a good vocal technician. He's not flat, he's not sharp. He basically could sing when he wanted to, but as time went on, he went away from that. But it's almost like if anybody had any, like a politician say idea, like a PR firm idea, if anybody had any shared kind of concern for his reputation, it would have been a really cool thing to go to him and say, Dave, just play by the rules a little more. You actually, do have bullets in your holster. You can sing, just do it more.
That's a really interesting theory, and it lends me to think of some frustration I have always had with him, is that for a guy who's so disciplined in so many different pursuits, right? I'm going to learn Japanese. I'm going to learn these martial arts. I'm going to do whatever it's going to be. It just never seemed to me like it always seemed to me like there should have been more discipline with preparing and taking better care of your voice. Like in the book, you mentioned, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but you give some coverage to when they went on Jimmy Kimmel. Van Halen did, doing dates. They did what Ellen and Jimmy Kimmel. And what drove me nuts was you didn't learn on a Tuesday that you were going to be on Jimmy Kimmel on a Thursday, right? But to come across as, he didn't goof on the lyrics, but his voice could have been better, is what I'm getting at, right? I mean, so that's kind of the puzzlement to me, that let's face it, been unmanageable, right? But if anybody could have pulled him aside, maybe some people tried, maybe it could have been Noel Monk, and Lord knows he worked his ass off to get to the point where he could sing for that first record. Kudos to Ted Templeman as well. It just never, he just never took that discipline or care, I don't think.
But to reiterate, my experience with that band, like, I don't think I saw them live until 2007, maybe. So my experience with the band is the records, and it never crossed our mind that he couldn't sing.
Right.
So you're talking about a live situation, and most of anybody I ever knew never saw them live. So it was like, literally, they sound great on the records. So
yeah, and there was no YouTube then either. And I think as you go back now, and there's so much stuff out there, and we'll get into that in a second. I mean, for as bad as the rep is, he always sucked live. No, he didn't. Not really. I thought he was, the first time I saw him solo many times, and I thought he sounded great. And Darren can wax poetically and enthusiastically about a David Lee Roth show and solo show, and I think it was Helsinki. Fans of the podcast know when he wants to, he can be unbelievably on. The 2007 tour, I don't think if even the most biggest detractors of his voice had to have given him props to be, to go, wow, he sounded great. He was prepared. He didn't, there was no goofing on the lyrics. He played it straight, and I have no complaints there.
Yeah.
To
correct, I did see him live on the Skyscraper tour as well. So
sure.
Well, and now, if I can be offensive right here and trigger some death threats potentially, people go, "Oh, Dave can't sing live." They do that argument, but they don't talk about there's particular tours when Ed, who is arguably the greatest guitar player ever, give or take, there were tours when Eddie was terrible. Obviously, the 2004 tour, because he was in a bad place. People say he wasn't great on the Balance tour. People say that he was not great on the 2007 tour because he was still cleaning up his act. So in other words, people are quick to rush to, the Dave can't sing live. But again, there's tours when Ed wasn't at his best.
Yeah. Or Alex, and the thing with Ed, which causes a preponderance of him to be able to do that, is that he's a bit of he's such a pure artist on the guitar. He's such a pure creative that he's one of these guitarists. There's two guys that he reminds me of in this respect, and one more so. Pete Townsend more so. I mean, I always liken Van Halen to the Who because they've got the exact same 4-piece power trio configuration. But you could say there's similarities in having flamboyant, amazing drummers. But the thing is, Ed is a little bit of a Pete Townsend in that he's getting you from A to B through the song, but it's not about the military precision of a Metallica riff or anything like that, right?
Right.
It's he's chattering to you. He's going to go in and out of the riff. He's going to throw in a lick. He's going to throw in a solo. He's going to throw in a short or long or medium range tapping thing, right? And Pete Townsend was like that too. Pete Townsend obviously wasn't the same amount of technician, but Pete Townsend would just basically play licks through a song kind of thing, right? And then, the other guy who kind of did that a little bit, who's more of a synthesis of that, although no, they say this about him live, is Ritchie Blackmore, right? People would complain about Ritchie Blackmore quite a bit in that respect, where he, live, you just wouldn't get the riff enough, right? Sort of thing. So yeah, it's funny. Poetically speaking, with Eddie, we know. So with Eddie, it's part of his nature, and then it's also part of the booze and the drugs, right? But he's literally doing. You're right there, and he's basically doing what Dave's doing on vocals. He's goofing around on the guitar while Dave's goofing around on the vocals.
Yeah, sometimes it turns out great, and sometimes it does not. But back to the focused interview, Steve. Tag back in.
Well, I want to throw a couple more big props to the book here, because one of the things I absolutely love is the chapter titles. 50 chapters essentially, and the titles are all Van Halen songs, which I think is ingenious. So, chapter 2 about Gene and Paul, Gene doing the demos. That chapter's called "Could This Be Magic?"
Steve, you got to clear up a question for me here. You're probably the only guy who can answer this. So, I came up with this idea and I started doing it on the first one, which was the David Bowie one. And Dennis loved it so much. He thought, oh, this is great. Yeah. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll do it on all of them. Right. So I did it on AC/DC and Kiss as well. And of course I did it here, and it's so much fun. It's really neat doing that. But my question to you is, have the other writers been doing this now?
I'm gonna be straight up with you. I can't recall. You've done the bulk of these books.
Well, there's been an Ozzy, there's been a Cooper, Alice Cooper.
Yeah,
I can pull them. Let me get one of them and tell you.
Okay, all right.
I do not. Even though I've read them several months ago, and my attention span being what it is, it always stood out to me that you do that, and I just think it was ingenious. But props to you if you thought of it first,
because it comes up a lot. Yeah, I definitely did, but it comes up a lot, and it always, the question in my mind is, did Dennis, because he liked it so much, did he go tell everybody to do this now? And I don't know the answer, right? Because I don't have any of those other ones. So
yeah,
you wrote that one. I'll get another one.
Okay.
Darren does have them all.
So what has there been so far? There's been Rush, Ozzy, Alice Cooper, Elton John too, right?
Yeah, Elton John, Bruce Springsteen at 75. I don't have any of those in the other ones in arm's reach at the moment. Rush doesn't come out till later in the year. Okay. Yeah, Alice came out over a year ago, Alice Cooper. So
I love doing it because people point it out, and it's cool because when you start matching and mixing and matching them, you're right. Little cool little in jokes come out that only the deep fans are going to understand. Yeah, I see why he picked that title.
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah,
it's funny.
All the ones I have, you wrote, Martin.
Oh, okay.
I'm writing some books.
All right. Sorry about that.
I don't have the Alice Cooper in arm's reach.
Sorry for putting you guys on the spot.
No, that's okay. But we should, I mentioned how encyclopedic it is also. I mean, and you in particular with all these books, is that it's not all rose colored. It's not a fanboy's perspective. I mean, when and where you need to, and I've seen this in the Kiss book in different places. I mean, you will bring up the negatives, which every band has, and you will offer your considered opinion when things did not work. In this case, with Van Halen, there's a couple different places, and we talked about some of the negatives there, but were there a couple things that you may have been hesitant, or just said, this is how I feel, this is what I'm doing? I mean, it's not only extremely thorough, but again, it's super honest.
It's funny you mention that because yeah, you're right. So one thing Dennis likes to do, and he came up with this, and it's kind of obvious, I guess, is we do have every studio album as one of the entries, right? So that's one of the fun things. Like, soon as it's a go ahead to do these books, it's like, oh, I get to pick my 50 things now, right? And there's a little bit of negotiation with Dennis, and usually he says something like, I can't get any pictures for that. Pick something different, kind of thing.
And we should mention too that what the Dennis we speak of is your editor, the guy who's kind of the overseeing editor and production.
Does a great job. Picks the pictures usually, helps write captions. We've been collaborating on that a bit, but you're right. So Van Halen, number one, Kiss fans and Van Halen fans, oddly enough, are two of the most notorious complaining fan groups in the world, right? And so I am writing these things, and yes, I do find lots of things to complain about. And the reason I brought up reviews is that's a natural place to complain. It's like if you're going to write a record review, you can be positive and negative there pretty easily. But sometimes I do feel like, and I've had this pointed out to me before, it's like sometimes I do worry a little bit about, am I complaining too much, right? Because I've had people say about my book sometimes, and it does concern me. They go, wow, he wrote a book on these guys. He doesn't seem like he's much of a fan, and I don't like seeing that, right? Because I totally am a fan. But that's the thing with us super deep fans of bands. I've noticed this with fans of bands that are way beyond the knowledge level that I am of bands. It's like once you get you start being a fan, and then you know, if you're a super fan, you're a fan of everything, and then if you're a super fan, you start seeing the cracks and the flaws, and you realize you can complain about stuff, and you're comfortable in your own skin complaining about it because you are a super fan and you're knowledgeable and you can back it up. And then the super fan, I know a lot of guys like this are the guys that eventually are buddies with all the guys in a band, and they really see what horrible people they are, right?
Yeah.
And then they know everything. They know all the skeletons in the closet. And so at that level, it's like you see them complaining about things that other people don't even really know about, right? And then they're letting things slip about them and stuff. So it is funny. I think as we become bigger and bigger fans, we feel a little more comfortable complaining about these bands.
Well, it's interesting too, because I think there's also a level of, you feel very protectionist, I guess, of the things you love, and you really try to avoid all those cringeworthy moments, of which Van Halen has given and certainly Dave has given a good number of them through the years. And it just reminds me of a quick anecdote. I'm a massive Cheap Trick fan, and I'm kind of at the point now where I don't think I can see them live anymore for a number of different reasons. And somebody happened to deign to give a fairly negative opinion of a show on a Cheap Trick fan page on Facebook, and of which I didn't disagree with. And oh my God, I mean, you would have thought you know, insulted somebody's mother. It was just, I mean, reality sets in. No matter, you can't avoid reality, you can't avoid aging, and that's why we're huge fans. That's why these podcasts exist, really. If it was all wonderful and great things, I mean, I suppose we could do a Taylor Swift podcast.
Yeah. Well, if I can rudely interject with a very rude question here, Martin, in all the research you did, and I, as a person who had to struggle through a David Lee Roth book, with Van Halen at 50, could you find one negative thing ever said about Michael Anthony that was said by a non-Van Halen?
Yeah, it's funny. Michael's an interesting case. I mean, there really is nothing negative to say about him. He's just a super nice guy, and he does some. He's not super talkative out there in the world, but he does participate in the world somewhat. He participates with Sammy. There's nothing really negative to say about him. I mean, I suppose the one thing, and I got into this with someone the other day. I mean, I suppose the one thing is that I always feel like you go down the road of these bands where this is a negative of what maybe he should have done, right? And because I've seen so many examples of this in other bands, it's like, whether you're a writer or not, you should start writing and get in there and start putting your 2 cents in and start pushing songs forward, because there's been so many stories in the past about A, that's where you're going to make your money down the road, but B, that's your creative legacy, and C, that's something that will start causing resentment in a band, and it caused problems in this band, and same with Ritchie Blackmore and John Lord and Ian Pace and all that as well, right? So, you know, in the early days, if those credits are distributed evenly, that's going to cause resentment pretty fast. And, you know, it also gets to the point, if you're not going to write in the band, be like a business guy with the band, like a Ricky Rocket or an Alex Van Halen. Or
I was going to say like the Bobby Dahl, because nobody really
Bobby Dahl, yes, Bobby Dahl as well.
Running Poison all these years later. Everyone thinks, oh, that useless bass player who's not really a musician, and they don't realize that Bobby Dahl is the one who's cutting all the deals and then does none of the interviews and just is happy to be in the background.
Exactly. And Alex getting involved with album covers and being fully, you know, pretty involved in sorting through tapes and all that kind of stuff. And
so what I'm getting at is there's never any stories with Michael Anthony about that guy drank too much, that guy had a tantrum, etc. You haven't heard anything. I haven't heard anything. Not one outburst.
Right. That's true as well too. And people talk about his background vocals, but then all of that goes down a murky road where who actually really is doing all these background vocals, who's actually playing bass here and there, right? I mean, there's a whole I've seen a lot of Reddit things recently, actually, long after writing the book, but I was kind of interested to see, I still don't have it like firmly in my memory, but I've seen a lot of Reddit people come down to a pretty clear idea of who was playing bass here and there throughout the catalog too, right?
Yeah, I think certainly there's so many bands, in particular, Kiss come to mind, Rolling Stones come to mind, a lot of other bands where the who's playing doesn't always line up with what's on the album sleeve credits. I mean, it's no secret anymore, but in particular, there's some bands that were, I mean, Darren and I always decry we always call like kind of a vault-like secrecy with Van Halen. And it's almost admirable in a way, but places like Reddit, other places where things start coming out and NDAs expire, it kind of at times it fascinates you and might prove some theories, but also can break your heart too,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Speaking of heartbreaking, when Dave left Van Halen, of course, as a chapter on the book, what were your thoughts at the time? Your most immediate thoughts? I was soon to be 18 years old, and it was like a breakup to me. I was befuddled, depressed, and perplexed, and bummed out over it all at that time. It was so earth shattering when you think of it too.
Yeah, if I think back, I've never really thought of this, but on a perspective of how important it was to me, it wasn't that important. I'll get into what I think about it, but I was into so much music, right? The new wave of British heavy metal had gone by. Thrash had started up. There were better hair metal. I loved hair metal. There were all sorts of great hair metal bands. I was loving Rat and Quiet Riot and Dokken and all that stuff, Twisted Sister. I was also, so I would have been in basically MBA school at that point. So I was in Hamilton, Ontario after the undergrad. So I was into all sorts of college rock, and I was loving Husker Du and Soul Asylum and the Replacements and REM and all that stuff, right? We were going to get Firehose soon, and Jane's Addiction and Faith No More and all sorts of other cool stuff as well. And Van Halen, it's like I'm loving these records. They're this massive band. They're okay. And then all of a sudden, different singer. I totally was, I've been a Sammy Hagar follower since probably 74, kind of thing. And so he gets in the band, and it's a really good choice because he's got this history of being actually more important and cooler and more legendary than Van Halen in one way, Montrose. And older and getting an album out 5 years earlier. So that's important, but also he's a successful solo artist with like 7 or 8 records at this point. Some of them have gone gold and platinum. So he's a big guy. He's got a great voice. So I think he's the perfect kind of guy to get in the band where you've got a guy who's got some authority. So they're not just hiring some kid who you're not going to respect at all in the band. So he's a guy on their level. And like I say, even a level above in one specific department. And he's so California looking, and he sings great. And, I do think a little bit that, and a lot of bands had this trouble. Rush had this problem as well, but he really fell for the 80s clothes too much, right? So he had that
and early 90s.
Yeah, exactly. And then the hair and everything, right? So I didn't think I never liked his look. And we made fun of him for that. And then of course he attracts scorn because out come the keyboards and the ballads and stuff as well. And you blame him somewhat for the complexion of the songs across these records. Whereas, like I say, at this point, we've got some pretty substantive thrash bands on the scene.
Sure. Death
metal's even starting to happen. Not that I was a huge fan, but there's lots of great metal. And so, as 5150 and OU 812 are happening, it's like, I guess I'm on board, but these are not my favorite albums of all time at this point.
Yeah, I part of it for me was, and I remember thinking at the time, and still always think this in hindsight's 2020, I thought Sammy was absolutely a perfect choice. It just, for all those reasons it seemed to make perfect sense, right? California guy, he's got a great voice. I think what got for me was, part of it was the keyboards, but the sound had so radically changed. As much as I always really did begrudgingly have to dig 5150, and certainly it was massively successful, that and OU812 was that paper thin sound that they just got, just compared to the Templeman records, where it wasn't, to my ears, it wasn't until For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, where they worked with Andy Johns, I went, okay, finally the rhythm section is back. There's some bottom end here. There's some thump to it all, which I couldn't help but wonder, my God, what would the title track to 5150 sounded like in Ted Templeman's hands, right? I mean, just where the playing was amazing, but it crept into the keyboards, it crept into the electronic drum sound, to which was a real puzzlement for me.
It's funny though, but in retrospect, as I go back, so I this happens to me with a lot of bands, right? They do things that you complain about, but then years and years later, you're glad it all happened because it gives you something to talk about and it gives you a story. Like Kiss making all those albums throughout the 80s,
sure.
all of Metallica's experiments with production, right? And so when I go back to 5150 now, it's like I'm kind of glad that they did this radical, strange production, and it almost feels like that's the most Brown Sound album out of all of them, where you get, and to me, Brown Sound means combination of certain things Eddie does and Alex does. So I like the radical drum sound now. I hated it at the time. But now I'm kind of glad it exists. To me, my main complaint was always the phoned in lyrics, the juvenileness, trying to be David Lee Roth sometimes, and then the very underwritten, even musical tracks, like things like Good Enough. And I hate Best of Both Worlds. I've always hated that song, right? It just seems like a jam, right? And so they always had an underwritten quality, but you can really notice it. So on those two albums specifically, it's the underwritten music and it's the underwritten lyrics that bother me the most.
Amen. I'm so glad to hear you say all of that those are underwritten songs. Even when they did their 2004 released things like Up for Breakfast, who said, yeah, this is done. This is totally a finished thing that the world should hear. It makes you wonder, in a way, with Ted Templeman in the mix, was he that editor that maintained the quality? Hence why an album like 1984 doesn't have filler on it, yet future albums without Templeman do have filler on it. I mean, no one can definitively answer that, but Ted was an editor.
Yeah. And it's funny. My favorite productions of Van Halen, period, bar none, way up top, are Up for Breakfast and what the heck's the other? It's About Time for Brown Sound, for absolutely crushing Brown Sound and Bottom End combined. Those two songs sound incredible. But you're right, they're both underwritten and both musically and lyrically as well. But it's like, and it's like Sammy's the main culprit, right? So as we found out later, I mean, here we've got more so Sammy's not working hard enough on the lyrics that starts to become the resentment and causes the break in the band, right? And I think there's something to be said for that.
Absolutely. And even the not working hard enough on the lyrics, Amsterdam was supposedly a big falling out between the Van Halens and him, that, hey, this is our city and you're making a song about weed, that kind of a thing. But Steve, I think Martin makes some very good points. What he said earlier about the fan versus the super fan versus the super fan. And for me, in writing the Roth book, not to make it the Darren interview, but I kind of went in and out of love again and again and again with Van Halen. For you, Martin, are you able to listen to Van Halen and just enjoy it?
Yeah, absolutely. Here's an interesting thing that we do all these video shows all the time. And one of my good buddies, Ralph Chapman, who's pretty much the best at ever doing this. He doesn't do enough of it. He's done a couple of our Contrarians episodes, but talking about music, you could just listen to that guy for an hour and a half and it's super captivating. But one of the things he said to me was he had a music teacher once that said, when you listen to an album, go through the whole thing, just listen to the vocals, go through the whole thing, just listen to the guitars, go through the whole thing, just listen to the drums, the production, listen to it those 6 times for 6 different things, sort of thing. The reason I bring that up is I've had a new appreciation for just listening to Van Halen albums for the abstract, totally subjective, hard to understand, hard to put into words idea of just the band chemistry of that band. Like you can listen to that band just for listening to their neurons fire off of each other. Like they are making music, right? And that's the thing. They get away with underwritten songs because they're a jazz band. They're just making music all half the time, right? And that's why you can listen to Up for Breakfast and just go, man, this is like just a great workout for my headphones, right? Kind of thing. So yeah, you could listen just for the guitar, just for the licks, just for the solos, just for what Alex is doing, just to hear him beat the hell out of his cymbals, right? So yeah, that's one of the cool things. I think you can just listen to Van Halen on so many levels, and it's just interesting. But like I say, I think the main cool new thing I've realized in the last 20 years is you can just listen to them just for the chemistry.
Well said.
Yeah, so that's a perfect segue to getting into more about the music, which ostensibly was how this podcast first started, with Darren and I having an offhanded conversation about, I think it may have been the Eat 'em and Smile Spanish version. And I went, this could be a podcast. Well, there's not a whole lot to talk about, although we've done an admirable job, I think, as far as talking about Dave's solo career, of which, has spent 25 years in a period of arrested development, unless you just strictly listen to what he's been trying to put out on YouTube, which is, God knows, that's a whole other that's a whole other episode. But you make the comparison, rightfully so, about Sammy's much more gratifying and bigger solo career. But I mean, is there stuff from Dave's solo career that still stands out to you, that you still go back to? And maybe the caveat outside of Eat 'em and Smile, what disappointed you? Kind of a broad-based question. I apologize, but there you go.
Yeah, no, I've for some show, what were we doing? It might have had some. Yeah, no, it was the ranking show Pete and I have been doing on Steve Tranquility, where we're mashing bands together. So I remember going through the David Lee Roth stuff again and realizing his solo catalog I was never much of a fan of, but now it's actually gone down a little, right? I don't even like Eat 'em and Smile very much. The thing I like the most is just a very small, obscure thing, and I like the artistic creativity and the bravery of Skyscraper not being particularly heavy. It's just it seems like everything on that album happens in the ether. And I think even Eat 'em and Smile is just a little more conservative and sober, but a lot of that also still happens in the ether. The thing I don't like about what he does, and Van Halen does this too, is just drives me nuts, is that when they try to play OTT, over the top or fast songs, they just sound frantic and like they're on the edge of falling apart, and they never sound heavy, right? So you think of Get Up or Elephant Gun or Shy Boy from Talus or Hot for Teacher. None of these songs sound heavy, even though they're written like the heaviest songs by these bands, right? That bothers me, right? Now, having said that, there's some substance, and I get some value out of A Little Ain't Enough. To me, that's their For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. It's the go to Vancouver and try harder idea.
Bob Rock.
Like, okay, I got to put in some work. It's the CD age, grunge is happening, everybody's kicking our ass. Let's just do a better job. So that's his 5-course meal album, right?
Right.
And then the other 5-course meal album is actually the DLR band album, yes, which is in such a funny place for so many fans. It's like everything on paper about that album is perfect, right? It's like, right, he's trying hard, he's being serious, it's heavy, it's got a good conservative but heavy enough production. There's enough joking around, but not too much. But then for the two things about it that are just drive everybody crazy is the name of the band and the fact that they just feel that the songwriting is not quite there. There's not enough great, sturdy, memorable songs on it, right? It sounds a little academic. So that's almost like A Different Kind of Truth a little bit, right? Where you want to love it more, and on paper, everything's great, and everybody loves it. It's this cool indie album that nobody knows about, but it's heavy. It's got great fireworks from John 5 on it and stuff. So it's almost like, to me, the two albums that are like, I actually packed a lunch and went to work, are the DLR band and A Little Ain't Enough. And I think Crazy from the Heat and Eat 'Em and Smile and Skyscraper are just goofing around. And I think Your Filthy Little Mouth is just goofing around, and Diamond Dave is just goofing around. And that's the whole catalog, right? There's nothing else.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, that's a super interesting take, and I'll be a bit of a contrarian, I guess, on the DLR band. And that here's the funny irony about that is that record and Your Filthy Little Mouth have so many co-writes. It's mostly all co-writes with Darren, help me out, his buddy from Pasadena, Terry Kilgore, thank you very much. And Terry plays on the DLR band record. And I mean, some of those songs, Black Sand and a couple other ones, I absolutely, and of course, everybody knows that record as being, quote, the John 5 collab record for them, as far as put aside the unreleased stuff that's mostly been released the last couple of years. But some of those songs I think are as strong as some of Dave Strong's stuff
I bet five of his top 10 songs are from that album. I'm just saying the whole album doesn't hold up, I don't think, really.
It's funny because the disappointment for me in that album was probably Slam Dunk, which was a single, which sounded formulaic and derivative, and that frenetic fast stuff where it was, okay, we're pulling all these, we're taking all these colors from the kind of the fast-paced frenetic Van Halen palette.
To add my color into the DLR band album, my issue with the whole thing is that we don't know the story to it. So that, yes, some of the songs are John 5, some of them are Terry Kilgore, some of them are Mike Hartman, who, is one of the Dave people that's kind of swept under the rug because he died young. He, like a Jason Becker kind of thing, that he got sick before Dave could show him off. Yet the little touring that was done in support of the album, the guitar player was Bart Walsh. Yeah, within a few years of that, the guitar player is Brian Young. So there you had 5 guitar players in basically like a 2 to 3 year period. And meanwhile, Dave's narrative on this DLR band album is like, we tracked it in 10 days. And you go, why are there 4 different guitars if you tracked it in 10 days?
Yeah.
And then also with bass, there's a bass player who's on 2 or 3 different songs named Tom Lilly. Then when he was hyping up the album, he's talking about how Billy Sheehan is back in this newsletter that's kind of deleted. But then he's talking about how Carmine Appice is his new drummer. And you go, wait.
None of this is true.
Yeah. Was the album made in Miami like he's saying it was? Was it made in LA? Is it 10 days? Is it 2 years? If I had a context as to what actually happened on that album, I could rationalize and go, oh, okay, this is Dave experimenting. But he's trying to make it sound like it was this DIY punk rock thing. And it wasn't. There's nothing DIY about it, except that he was literally pressing the CDs in his backyard. That's the only DIY punk rock thing about it.
Great. Wow, that's a great explanation. But to me, it's literally, I would say it's actually his most conservative album. I think it's pretty close to even the debut Van Halen album in that it's the most soberly, conservatively put together. And then but it's very close with A Little Ain't Enough. It's like those two are the most regular rocker albums that he did.
Yeah, good point. I mean, I guess overall with Dave solo stuff, one, I wish there was more of it. And 2, I do appreciate, especially the stuff that's just been released, various covers, a lot of the digitals, the stuff that we've seen on the bizarre No Holds Barbecue movie / backyard DVD, whatever the hell it was back then, was that he always has taken chances. So for a lot, even when there was commercial considerations involved, maybe he didn't swing for the fences there, but there's so much of that stuff where because he's never been that one-dimensional rock guy. I mean, they were doing Casey and Sunshine Band covers, for goodness sakes, back in backyard parties. And that was strictly because of Dave. Alex didn't come in and go, hey, we got to do this track, because I love Ohio Players or whatever it was,
Yeah.
So getting back to the book again, we have got a few minutes left here, but you do something that I think was so ingenious, which to me is worth, the price of the book alone. And that is you did something, your proposed next Van Halen record, which I thought was genius, where you basically had a list of the 12 unreleased tracks that are all out there in various forms from YouTube, and you put it into a sequence and gave some explanations. And one, kudos on that, but two, that'd be just a fantastic idea. But it's just a reminder of, if you thought it was just this Gene Simmons sessions, which fed off so many things, there was so much great stuff that is so perplexing on why it didn't make different records or what happened to it. And it's also all Dave stuff you put out there, except for one song. You said somehow Dave's vocals should get on this.
Yeah, and you know that the reason to do that is, yes, to highlight these other songs that didn't get used, but obviously there's such a tie-in with the Different Kind of Truth, because that's how that album was made. And then there's a tie-in with this thing that we all kind of wish, but Wolfgang won't do it. It's like, go back to the tapes, find stuff, find riffs, repeat those riffs, use AI, use whatever, get your relations back with Sammy or Dave or both. And I firmly believe that if somebody wanted to and went back to all of that jamming that Dave did, or I mean that Eddie did at 5150, you know, you could bring, you know, proverbially Eddie back to life, and literally, while those two guys are still with us and can still sing, I swear you could make probably 3 Van Halen albums, and they would sound absolutely great in conjunction with this idea of getting these old songs as well. But yeah, it's like that stuff's all there. I did a whole podcast episode about crazy ideas, and I might actually did a whole one on this, but one of the ideas that I just think with all these rockers, if and when they're complaining about, oh, I don't have any money, I didn't make any money, I want to leave some money behind for my kids and all this stuff, while you still got that golden voice, get out there and sing the phone book, sing everything, sing covers, do some originals, get them on tape, use that voice, because that voice is going to go eventually, right? And this is such a perfect example where both these singers are still with us. And in the studio, you can make Dave and Sammy both sound like absolute blinding superstars if you wanted to. And yeah, we're just probably not going to get these Van Halen albums, but Wolfgang is the guy sitting there. He's so talented. He could drum them, he could bass them, he could play extra guitar, he could do backup vocals, he could produce them. He's so talented. He's probably more talented than anybody that was ever in Van Halen, right?
Right.
And literally, you know, he could do it if he wanted to, but he, you know, it's the emotional thing of losing dad. But you know, I don't think it would take much of a rearrangement of the concept and say, well, if you want to really pay tribute to dad, you could actually you know, bring all this great new music and put it out in the world.
But on a brighter note, we have your book, and even if we're not getting the final legacy pieces we need from our favorite bands, we know that there is a Martin book about your favorite band coming soon. So thank you for your decades of great contributions to content related to some of my favorite artists ever. Steve, is that fair to say?
Absolutely fair to say. And again, you know, I'm completely biased because I've worked with you for a while, but I mean, just, you know, your books, the stuff you've self-published are just amazing. I mean, the deep dives you take, this is all the stuff that when I get insomnia, I start thinking about. And, you know, these are all the conversations I want to have had, or would love to have someday, and that are in your book. So, I mean, just huge kudos, Martin. I mean, I always dig talking to you, and this was so special.
Yeah, very nice of you guys. Thanks very much.